right, welcome into Surviving Paradise, the little podcast that takes a sometimes serious, oftentimes humorous look at the claim by Jehovah's Witnesses that they are living in a modern day spiritual paradise. I am your host, Stacy Bauman, former elder, ministerial servant, most importantly, a kid raised in Jehovah's Witnesses throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Warning, we try to have some fun here. There's a lot of sarcasm. There's some humor. Sometimes there's some flat out tears. It can get emotional, but please note it is never, ever meant to offend anyone. It is simply my own observations, perceptions, sometimes crazy thoughts and stuff from my brain, and I like to share them. So please know that it's not meant to offend. And I do want to issue, as I do at the beginning of this particular episode, a little bit of a trigger warning, particularly for the ladies. This subject is focused a little bit on the feminine, as you will come to understand. And just want to note, we're going to talk about some somewhat sensitive subjects right from the magic book. So here we are. We have arrived at our third installment of Story Time with the King, a little three-part series that has seen us open up the pages of the New World Translation of the Bible, written and approved by Jesus Christ himself, the chief Jehovah's Witness, and help us to take a closer look at the King's own words over the last few weeks. And more importantly, help us all examine how the 2023 governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses applies Jesus' example, Jesus' principles, Jesus' guidelines. After all, it's very important as they lead 8 million plus people into a paradise earth, a paradise that they promise is coming any second now. Hey, maybe it'll even happen during this podcast episode. I hope sharing my thoughts, experiences, and my own practical applications has jogged your own memories and given you some new things to think about over the last couple of weeks as we tackle some of my, some of my favorite stories from the King himself. And again, over the last two episodes, we've covered two of my favorites, the Good Samaritan and the Prodigal Son. If you're interested in hearing our thoughts on that, please do give those a listen. But those are two stories that have given hours and hours of thought to me personally since I was a young boy in the 1970s. Those were two stories that, quite frankly, made me question the intelligence of the governing body and, more importantly, question the motive of the governing body. Both of those stories are filled with messages on love, on forgiveness, on mercy, and on rendering real, practical help to people, even those people that might be our enemy or someone that is sinning. I reached what I think is a pretty reasonable conclusion many years ago, and that conclusion was this. With Jesus ensuring he shared these parables with people during his vacation here on the earth, and then having it recorded in his personal book known as the Holy Bible, isn't it reasonable that we should expect that the men he chose to lead his people in the most critical century in human history, over the last century plus, would not only grasp the messages in these stories? After all, the book was written for them, allegedly, or so they claim. Wouldn't that be a reasonable conclusion? That they would emulate and apply the loving qualities that Jesus taught were important for all the planet to see, particularly from his hand-picked leadership. So, where are you personally on that? After reading those stories, considering some of the thoughts, are you a little disappointed? That's probably doesn't quite cover it, to put it lightly. I will say it again. If you are a Jehovah's Witness bravely listening to this little crazy show, you do not need an apostate friend. You don't need some awful website to access, or a book, or anything else written by an apostate or someone who has left Jehovah's Witnesses. All you need to do is read your own Bible and your own literature. Let your gut do the rest. Let your gut do the rest. So if at this point you're uncomfortable, I'd really like you to stay as we consider the third story. But if it's too uncomfortable, feel free to turn it off. Just go read your own literature and your own Bible. But we hope you stick around. Okay, so we're not done. I promised the 3 parables or stories that impacted me the most personally as a Jehovah's Witness, and I now want to deliver on that promise. Let's finish this little series up with a story that has always deeply impacted me. In fact, at certain times, I would even say this might be my favorite of the 3 stories. I'm not sure. It depends on the mood I'm in, but it is in my top 3. I'm going to share a third story that I personally often leaned into and reread and considered, especially during my time as an 11-year elder. I would lean into this story for shepherding calls. I would lean into this story for local needs talks, and I gave plenty of them. I would lean into this story for much more, just personal conversations, particularly, as we'll see, with ladies. And this week, I want to get the ladies involved, the women. This small, often overlooked story from Jesus' life involves women. Have you ever noticed, and I brought this up in the past on past episodes, have you ever noticed how close Jesus of the Bible was to women? Have you ever sat back and truly contemplated the impact women had on Jesus' life? How he seemed to be drawn to them and how he trusted them with much more than pioneering or cleaning the toilets at the district convention. Okay, you know where this one's going. Whether I was a kid or I was an elder, I read this story and came away with much, much more than I would ever hear at a Watchtower study or in a talk or in a district convention part. And so I'm very curious to see if I'm alone or if some of you fine mentally diseased apostates listening may just agree with me on this. I absolutely love this story, and I love that the main character is a woman. Because as I've said before, Jehovah's Witnesses have a steady torrent of misogyny, period. It's without question, without doubt present in every congregation. You'll never see a woman opening a congregation meeting with prayer. She just doesn't qualify. So again, I got to tell you, I love this story. And this story hit me hard as a kid, but it hit me 10 times harder as an elder. Now, I've mentioned before, I was a very young elder in my circuit at the time at the ripe and mature and life experienced age of 27. And I took it really, really seriously at the time. The idea that I would be judging my fellow believers, sometimes decades older than me, sometimes female, just insane. Or that I'd be responsible for their lives. It was really heady stuff for me, particularly as a kid who grew up without a father, single parent household with my mom, etc. So I personally dove into the Gospels hard with the idea that I would just copy everything Jesus did. He was my guy. He was my example. He was my father in a lot of ways by extension. He had the wheel in my life. Give Jesus the wheel. And I, of course, believed the same was true by extension of the governing body. Although in those days, I couldn't tell you who the hell they even were. Most of us didn't grow up in the 70s, 80s even knowing who they were. So different from today where they're on their own broadcasting studio channel on a regular basis. But this story in particular was one that I honed in on as an elder, and I often got some pretty weird looks from other elders when I brought it up, especially when I tried to apply it to a modern day situation. It wasn't the typical story an elder would lean into in a tough situation, but it was for me. And it was particularly when I was trying to help women or the sisters in the congregation. And I've shared and will continue to share, did a lot of that as an elder, particularly with teenage girls, single parent families, etc. So, the story. Let's take a look at the story that continues to impact me to this day. That's the truth. A story that I think is often overlooked and highly underrated when you want to peek into how a man, woman, or any Jehovah's Witness should be treating others. And it comes from the King himself. It's the story referred to oftentimes as the woman with the flow of blood. Now, this story can be found in 3 places in the Bible. That's right, 3 places. 3 places. Apparently, this is one of Jesus' favorite stories, too, because he made sure it was recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels. Interesting. I can't explain what went into his decision to have 3 different guys cover the story, especially since none of the 3 were there to even witness it. Again, I try to stay off the Bible subject. It's its own subject. But you can find this at Matthew chapter 9, Luke chapter 8, and Mark chapter 5. And for the purpose of this story time with the King, we're going to read from Mark 5, 25 through 34 in the New World Translation, Jesus approved version. As we read this story, put yourself in the crowd and compare Jesus' actions with this woman to the actions of the 9 guys in upstate New York that he personally hand-picked to guide his people today, including women who make up the majority of the 8 million of Jehovah's Witnesses today. To understand the weight of this story and, well, what this host brain would drift away on, we have to discuss the uncomfortable details of what it means to have a flow of blood. Ladies, wonderful ladies that listen to this show, I apologize in advance. There is probably nothing more irritating than listening to a man explain something he will never, ever experience. I get that. It's uncomfortable for me too. I can't imagine the pain. I can't imagine all the issues, although we're going to try, of this, giving birth to a baby, so on and so forth. I have stripped off the idea that because I was born with a penis, I am somehow smarter and able to teach from the stage than you are. It is absurd. It is absurd. So I apologize in advance. But I'm going to do my best to break down why this story is important and what it says about the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses in 2023. Let's do this. Okay, trigger warning. Yes, I'm going to be sarcastic. I'm going to be juvenile on some of these details. I will be careful. I just know me. I don't think it will take away from the impact of this story. So follow along with me. Wow, it's been a while since I said that into a microphone. At Mark 5:25 in the New World Translation, a book, again, Jesus himself approved. He is the final editor and copywriter of the story in his book, and each and every edition. Okay, so let's set the stage for context. Jesus and his apostles just got done dealing with demon possession, including sending some demons into some pigs and off a cliff. Again, bacon. Bacon was bad, very, very bad. They get out of a boat, a massive crowd gathers, and a presiding officer of the synagogue named Jairus falls down on the ground begging Jesus to save his very sick daughter who is clearly dying. Jesus agrees, and he starts to head to his house to save the little girl who has only minutes left when the following happens. Here's the power. Mark 5:25, quote, it says, "Now there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years. She had suffered much at the hands of many physicians and had spent all her resources. And she was no better, but rather had become worse. End quote. Kick back and take a journey into the three-ring circus that is my brain. I'm sorry. Here we go. So many Jehovah's Witnesses read that story and say, well, that's sad. That's so sad. But they never really contemplate what is happening here or the weight of what this woman is going through. Let's break this down. After all, it seems like an important story even to Jesus. He had 3 different guys tell the story, and I'm breaking it down for a reason. We'll get there. Let's focus in on the details from the chambers of my mind. You'll note, she was apparently alone. There's no mention in the story of a husband or kids, and are you honestly surprised by that? Let's be blunt for a second. A Jewish man had one thing on his mind: making babies. Lots of kids. It was part of the culture. He was actually commanded back in the Garden of Eden to fill the earth. And the Jewish culture required large families. You'll remember lots of guys with 12 sons. You'll remember guys with lots of concubines and wives. What was the purpose? Making babies. For this poor woman, her worth in that culture and at that time, and Jesus knew it, was in being a mother. That would have been impossible with a woman that was constantly bleeding for 12 years. Folks, for any of us that have been in a relationship with a woman, I can tell you that every month I literally have oodles of compassion and sometimes hide, let's be honest, for what a woman goes through biologically on her cycle, on her period. It's brutal, and it's on time every month. You know you're going to be in pain. And I think it's safe to say this woman wasn't going out on a lot of dates. Do you think it's safe to say that this poor woman in this story led a very lonely life? Now there's something that a Jehovah's Witness female can relate to. No romance, not enough brothers, no one's interested. There aren't enough qualified baptized guys. Subject for another day. But I think it's safe to say she's alone in this story, and we can probably figure out why. She's probably not going to be a mother. Men aren't interested in her. She is bleeding. Bleeding for 12 years. I don't remember what I did 12 days ago. But she knows that this is her life now. And you'll note, we aren't given her age in the story. Jesus left it out. But again, 12 years. So where is she age-wise? Is she in panic mode, watching her childbearing years race away from her as she again bleeds? How old was she when this got started? Was she a young girl? Was she a woman? Can you even begin to imagine what this woman is going through? This story is so underrated and so often overlooked. Look, I'm going to admit something that I'm not proud of, okay? If I have a stomach ache for 12 minutes, I am the worst person on earth. Straight up man baby. I am not going to lie about it. I'm coming clean. What kind of physical pain was this woman in? How is she managing the pain? Tylenol? A quick trip to get some Midol? Oh, wait a minute. A detail no one discusses. She's bleeding. She's probably in horrific pain. It's an unbelievable story. And listen, can we get really delicate for a few minutes? Okay? I'm going to try to keep this above board, not be a stupid guy, and really try to keep this, serious for a second. Again, it is a peek into my thoughts over several decades. but I need to get into some sensitive subjects here for a few minutes. Folks, today, one of our lovely ladies can run down to the grocery store and she can pick up feminine hygiene products. You know, tampons, pads. Without getting too crazy, some work better than others. Some are super absorbent. And yes, I know this because I've been brave enough to buy them for a woman I loved. So there it is. I'm the guy that goes into the store and has no problem doing this. And by the way, a tip for the guys, learn what works for her and man up. Go get that stuff when she needs it, okay? But the point is, she can go get this stuff. But this woman, in the story Jesus is here sharing with us, she had nothing. Nothing. Folks, have you ever really read this story? Or maybe I'm the whack job that I think I am. And really thought about what a day in this woman's life looked like? If she wasn't bleeding, you can bet she was worried about bleeding. There's no indication she knew when it was coming. It just came and came for 12 years. It could come on at any moment, unannounced. She walked around in a constant state of terror, on the verge of a panic attack. Does anyone blame her? As guys, look, we're pansies on a lot of things. I don't know what we do with 12 years of a flow of blood. I can't handle 12 minutes of a stomachache. Okay? But again, this story pops. It's rich. It's ripe with how to live life. All because of this woman and the misery she is going through. How did she live? Jewish women didn't carry a purse around with some easy application tampons in the pocket for those emergency situations. Doesn't exist. She simply had to hide. She probably hid all the time. Look, we're mature enough to talk about it today. Today, if a woman has an accident and her period arrives unannounced, she can swing into action or ask for help, and guys, man up. Been there, done that. A well-placed hoodie tied around your lady's waist to cover over a surprise disaster can be a lifesaver, and you should do it. But this woman had none of this. She had none of this. She had no one. She had no pain relief. She had no feminine hygiene products. And could it be that's why Jesus decided to share the story with the entire universe? Not to embarrass her, but to show the depth of pain. You'll note he actually saved her from any embarrassment. We don't even know her name. He left that out, probably for her benefit. Again, we're not going to get into the Bible and its accuracy, okay? But let's extend the story. And again, I warned everyone at the outset, this is where my mind and brain went as I built local needs parts, as I crafted that shepherding call that would have impact, as I just talked to someone I loved that was female. Let me ask you this. How much do you appreciate your washer and dryer? I'm hoping everyone listening has one. Perhaps you're in a developing country listening and you don't, which is awful and not right. But how much do you appreciate your washer and dryer? No, seriously. Pause. Think about it. How would your life change without your washer and dryer? My life would be a disaster. Now imagine, you've never heard of a tampon or a maxi pad or Depends. You live in cloth rags. And oh, did we mention you're constantly bleeding for 12 years? How did this poor woman in this story keep her clothing clean? How did she do it? You're going to laugh, but as a teenager, I remember picturing her down by a stream, beating her bloody clothes against rocks, trying to get the stains out, bawling her eyes out, no friends, no one to help her, Her clothes are a mess. Her life is a mess. She's in pain. Yeah, I guess I'm weird, but it's true. I thought about that, and that's why it's one of my top 3 stories. But back to the story. And again, I highlight all that because it's often overlooked. It's a few sentences. There's this woman. Isn't it terrible? She's been bleeding for 12 years. Everyone moves on. You're sitting at the circuit assembly, chewing on your gum, looking at your phone, listening to this talk. You're not getting the impact of the story. This woman is alone in the crowd. Back to the story, by the way. And there's no mention of even girlfriends. There's not even some females there to help her. No surprise, I'll cover this in a few minutes, but her life is obviously sheer loneliness. And as the verse said there in Mark, she spent every dime she had that she had to desperately seek help from doctors. Jesus made sure that was recorded again in all 3 stories by all 3 guys in his book known as the New World Translation. Interesting, no? It's an interesting detail. She was broke, and the condition had gotten worse. Let's call this exactly what it is. She is beyond desperate mentally, emotionally, and physically. She's been bleeding for 12 years. There is a good chance, based on the time period and context, that she dies from this. And if she doesn't die physically, her mental health is clearly rapidly deteriorating. Why do I say that? Stay tuned as we continue the story. But maybe at this point you're thinking, okay, Stacy's gone off the rails. He's lost his marbles. Why are any of my crazy questions and observations I just shared interesting at all? Those are good questions and might be true. Well, in my mind, this story's power is in what Jesus says and does next. And with all those crazy realities and questions in my own mind with the story, it really is what he does. That's the entire point of the story. And remember, according to the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, the Bible, all 3 guys who recorded this story and everything in this entire book was made for them. Them. So they alone could guide us. To them alone, as the quote says in the Watchtower, its pages are an open book. They are the recipients of this book. The rest of us just get to kind of enjoy it. Keep that in mind. If you'd like a quick reminder from the Fine Nine in upstate New York, the United in Worship book, page 111, says this, quote, special attention was being given to make up the government that would rule mankind for 1,000 years, and nearly all the inspired letters in the Christian Greek scriptures are primarily directed to this group of kingdom heirs, the holy ones, partakers of the heavenly calling, end quote. Their book, their words. All of this was given to them to guide the rest of us into a world filled with pressed dresses, fruit basket, nice pairs of khakis, and koala bears. They're supposed to be giving us these instructions. This entire story of this woman should impact them more than it impacts you and me. So surely the 9 guys in New York grasped the power and the meaning of what happens next. Right? Right? Let's read it. Back to Mark chapter 5, quote, when she heard the reports about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his outer garment. For she kept saying, if I touch just his outer garments, I will get well. And immediately her flow of blood dried up, and she sensed in her body that she had been healed of the grievous sickness. End quote. Whoa. Lot to unpack here. She takes a chance. She works her way through a crowd and just touches Jesus' garment. Folks, this story is huge. And the governing body, again, keep in mind, are the recipients of this story. They're the guys that should know more about this and it should have a heavier impact on everything they do than you and me. We just get to enjoy it. They get to really enjoy it. This story is filled with so much depth and character that it still blows my mind, particularly because it's so underrated and overlooked. The common Jehovah's Witness will read this and think, okay, I can't wait to get out of this Kingdom Hall and outside on this sunny Sunday. This meeting is starting to bore me. But you can't gloss over this woman's story. She wasn't just a sick lady who believed in Jesus and rolled up to a congregation get-together. That's not the case. This woman was living a horrible, deeply depressing, and physically painful life, minute by minute, by day, by week, by month, by 12 years. But here's the part many don't consider. By just seeking out Jesus and working her way into a crowd, oh boy, brace yourselves. This woman was committing sins. She was putting everyone in that crowd at risk in her desperate attempt to just touch Jesus' clothes. She was sinning. She was sinning for just being near people. Ah, yes. The context and power of this story is everything. As this verse indicates, she touched Jesus and she was instantly healed and her blood dried up. Folks, this woman was bleeding badly when she entered that crowd. Uh-oh. Blood. She was bleeding because when she touched him, she was instantly healed. Why is that a big deal? And why mention it at all? It's not just my crazy head. Because she was sinning and bringing uncleanness to everyone in the crowd/congregation. Imagine you're this poor nameless woman. You're out there bleeding in the hot Middle Eastern sun, and the entire time you're working your way through that crowd, you've got the following buzzing in your head as a dedicated Jewish woman, like a baptized Jehovah's Witness woman. I'm now going to read what was undoubtedly going through her mind as she worked her way through the crowd. And it comes to us from Jesus' book. Leviticus 15:19 through 27 reads like this. Again, woman, bleeding, hot Middle Eastern sun, trying to find the guy named Jesus, touching people, moving throughout the crowd, and this is undoubtedly in her head. Quote, Leviticus 15:19, if a woman has a discharge of blood from her body, she will continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days. Anyone touching her will be unclean until the evening. Anything she lies down on in her menstrual impurity will be unclean, and everything she sits on will be unclean. Anyone touching her bed should wash his garments, his garments, bathe in water, and be unclean until the evening. Anyone touching any article she sat on should wash his garments, bathe in water, and be unclean until the evening. Apparently the bath didn't do it. If she sat on the bed or on another article, his touching it will make him unclean until the evening. And if a man lies down with her and her menstrual impurity comes on him, because ladies plan it, my God, he will then be unclean for 7 days, and any bed on which he lies down will be unclean. That's right, folks, burn the bed. It continues, when a woman's discharge of blood flows for many days when it is not the regular time of her menstruation, or if she should have a flow longer than her usual menstruation, she will be unclean during all the days of her discharge, as in the days of her menstrual impurity. Any bed she lies on during the days of her discharge will become like the bed of her menstrual impurity, and any article she sits on will become unclean, like the uncleanness of her menstrual impurity. Anyone touching them will be unclean, and he must wash his garments, bathe in water, and be unclean until the evening. End quote. Where do I even begin? Ah, yes, the rules. The rules for the biology of being a female created by God and Jesus, the storyteller himself. Everything she touches while bleeding, in this woman's case, is unclean. If she sits on something, if she lays on something, if someone touches her, I'm surprised they didn't say if someone looks at her. Everything she does while bleeding is unclean. Again, what was a day in this woman's life like? Imagine this woman's life. No one wants to be anywhere near her. No one. Not a man, not other people, not her bed, not anything she sits on, not her clothes, nothing. She is alone. She is bleeding constantly. She is likely weakened from blood loss, as iron is a very important thing to the ladies. No future to speak of in her case. She's likely embarrassed. She's likely constantly ashamed. Her mental health is in the shitter. She can't find a cure, and now she is sinning against God himself, the only God she hopes will help her. This story has always seemed absolutely and utterly soul-crushing to me. This woman is desperate. She is seeking the help of anyone, someone that will just be a little kind to her, including a complete stranger, apparently, in Jesus. The doctors have failed. I often wondered how they even helped her because they can't be anywhere near her. She is willing to risk it all in this crowd she's working her way through, making them all sinners and unclean, to get some help, some comfort, some peace. She's broke financially. She's broke mentally. She's broke physically. This is it. And she's breaking the rules. Rules given to her by Jehovah and his son firsthand. Might I add that the rules are in stone. Yeah, I know. Literally at least the first 10 according to Moses. We can't just ignore the rules, can we? I mean, let's meditate on this for a minute. You can't break the rules in favor of compassion, can you? You can't break the rules in favor of mercy, can you? You can't break the rules in favor of giving someone practical help, can you? I mean, this is almost as serious as saving seats for people not in your car group at the district convention, right? Or maybe like wearing a colored shirt on stage if you're a brother, right? This is serious stuff. Rules are rules according to the governing body. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen to this woman in the account? Will she be counseled by 2 apostles in the B school at the temple? Maybe disfellowshipped for uncleanness. I'm sure what happens next is where the governing body got some of their rules or guidelines for helping people that are unclean today, right? Right? And remember something, as we read how Jesus reacts to this bleeding rule breaker, Jesus is rapidly on his way to Jairus' daughter to save her life. Remember, the story starts, they get there, there's a crowd, Jairus falls on the ground, my daughter is dying, please come save her. Jesus is making his way to Jairus' house. He's a little busy, saving lives and stuff. But this woman touches him, as he makes his way to the dying little girl. Back to the account. Quote, immediately Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out of him. And he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my outer garments? But his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you and you ask who touched me? I got some questions too, apostle guys. However, he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, frightened and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Remember, folks, everyone in the crowd is now unclean. Jesus says to her, quote, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go back and read Leviticus 15. No, oops. No. Go in peace and be healed from your grievous sickness. End quote. Go have a life, little one. You're okay now. You're okay. Wait a minute, King Jesus. Wait a minute. Wait a minute, leader of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, writer of the Watchtower magazine, and writer of the Secret Elders Handbook, creator of Jehovah's Witness Broadcasting, and big brother to Stephen Lett. What are you doing in this story? Have you consulted the governing body, the body of elders in your local congregation? Since when did someone in grave physical pain matter? Since when did you give her a future and a life she didn't have seconds ago? No more bloody clothes. Maybe a man will fall in love with her and she can have children. Because, listen, I know of judicial committees in matters of pain and sorrow that you set up, Jesus, you blessed, for a woman who smoked marijuana while undergoing cancer treatment, and we had to discipline. Sure, it was just private reproof, but, rules are rules. Right? Since when did depression and loneliness matter? Because rules are rules. And I've sat on judicial meetings you assigned me to, Jesus, in your congregation. You remember the sister who was alone and finally met a man who loved her, dated him, married him, but oh my God, he wasn't a baptized Jehovah's Witness, much less an elder or ministerial servant, so we had to strip her of her pioneer status. You remember, right? The Holy Spirit was with us in that room. Since when did this stuff matter? Since when does someone get off committing a sin of uncleanness in a crowd of people for everyone to see and get away without a public reproof or a disfellowshipping? You remember, before all onlookers, because again, the 9 guys in New York say, rules are rules. And this woman in your story broke them, and she actually made other people unclean. Whoa. What a story. And the questions keep coming. For a second, the compassion. What Jesus did here should impact everyone, whether you believe in him as an actual entity or not. He gave her everything she never had that day. When she walked into that crowd, desperate, alone, who knows where her mental health was, bleeding, her life was essentially over. And he gave her life, hope, relationship, motherhood, everything. But how does that jive with the 9 guys in New York? Because rules are rules. In fact, folks, I'm looking here in the Shepherd the Flock of God book, the Secret Elders Handbook, and I'm looking at chapter 12, subheading 14. And Jesus, frankly, you gave this to your buddies in upstate New York, and they sent it to all of us as elders. It reads like this on matters of uncleanness. In the subheading, gross uncleanness, uncleanness with greediness, it says this, quote, Galatians 5:19 through 21 lists many vices that are not classed as porneia, but they could lead to one's being disqualified from God's kingdom, a death sentence. Among them are uncleanness. When one practices uncleanness to a serious degree, it can be grounds for disfellowshipping from the Christian congregation. Elders should use good judgment in discerning whether the conduct is minor uncleanness that can be handled by counsel or is gross uncleanness that requires the formation of a judicial committee. End quote. Oh my. 3 guys with 10-hour service averages, some of them as young as 27, this guy, are now being told to consider what this woman with the flow of blood was doing. Was this minor? Was it major? How many people were unclean? How many people do we need to talk to? How many times was she unclean? Oh boy. In the Shepherd the Flock of God book on matters of uncleanness, you'll note it can cost you your life. You can be disfellowshipped. Jesus doesn't mention that in his story. It goes on to list in the Elder's Secret Handbook, it goes on to list things like not taking showers is unclean, or not brushing your teeth is unclean, smoking pot is unclean, or just having sexy talk over a cell phone is also unclean. I know you forgot to mention them in this story, Jesus, of the woman with the flow of blood, or in fact mention this anywhere in the Bible for that matter, but this woman, well, she's breaking the rules and she's unclean. And you let her off? You just let her walk away healed and happy? Wow. Gotta tell you, within your organization, times have really changed. Unbelievable. I could go on, but I'm guessing you get the point. This woman with the flow of blood was unclean, and she made everyone in that crowd unclean that day. Jehovah's words, not mine. See Leviticus 15. But in the story, compassion was the order of the day, not rules. And to me, the best part is Jesus referring to this poor woman as daughter, a very tender, compassionate way to address a woman who was terrified. It's right there in the account. Trembling, shaking, scared out of her mind. And I want to point out again here, folks, because I think it's an important point, Jesus was a little busy. He was on his way to save someone else, but he stopped, he took the time and addressed her pain on the spot. She didn't need to write a letter of reinstatement or set up a meeting at the B school. On the spot, he addressed her and called her his daughter. And have you ever made this connection in your head like I did? Folks, by just touching Jesus, guess what? She was making Jesus unclean. She made Jesus unclean. And the apostles. There was no formal meeting about this. Jesus didn't go around making sure everyone was clean again, like, a Harry Potter wand or something. It didn't matter. The rules went out the window in favor of kindness and compassion. He could have viewed her as selfish and spreading her uncleanness everywhere, but not a word of that either. Did you notice? Did you notice? Because I did as a young guy and as an elder as I built this story in my head. There was no condemnation of her making everyone else unclean, that she was bad association or she was a sinner or a bad woman. He doesn't even talk about it. He just takes care of her. Novel idea. Today, if a Jehovah's Witness just knows, just has knowledge that someone has committed a sin and doesn't report it to the elders, that person too will be disciplined as unclean or sometimes blood guilty. See Tony Morris blowing out matches. What? This story is so utterly powerful, and it condemns the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses to the 10th degree. There is nothing in here about formality or rules. She made Jesus unclean. She made the apostles unclean. She made the crowd unclean. No announcement. Jesus doesn't do anything. He calls her his baby girl. He heals her, and she goes off and has a life. No judicial meeting. No investigative committee. No shepherding call. She showed faith, and all he said was, go and be well. And my God, what he gave her. He gave a woman who would have no life as a Jew and changed everything. If only the Bible was more clear and the three guys kind of did a follow-up with her 10 years later. Does she have babies? Is she married to a nice man? Does she have friends? Can you even begin to imagine a congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses operating in such a way today? There's going to be at least one, and I do not say don't comment. I don't say cease and desist. Please send me your thoughts even when you disagree. But there will be at least one Jehovah's Witness apologist that will say, well, yeah, come on now. That's Jesus. Elders can't read hearts today like he could. What exactly did Jesus, their boss, do? You can't use that Jehovah's Witness throwaway on this story, and that's part of why I love it. Jehovah's Witnesses say, wow, Jesus did all this stuff, but elders can't read hearts. They're not Jesus. Oh, okay. I'll go with that. He is the creator. But folks, where in this story does Jesus read a heart? Anybody want to share? Jesus didn't even know who touched him. So he certainly didn't or couldn't just read her heart. He didn't even know who touched him. He based his reaction strictly on her actions, motive, nuance. She was desperate, lonely, scared, and likely dying. She tried. She tried. And that is all that mattered. Yeah, I'm getting dramatic because I love this story. I love it. She tried. That was it. He wasn't reading hearts. He didn't even know who touched him. Someone tried. You may be sitting here wondering, how does all this get missed by the governing body, or by extension, a publisher among Jehovah's Witnesses today? How do they miss all this? This story is so incredibly powerful, and it's so incredibly condemnatory of the culture, the rules, the processes, the procedures, the letters, the books, all of it that exists among Jehovah's Witnesses today. This is their guy, their king. The rest of us have to be one of them to be friends with him, their guy. And in this story, none of the crap you see a Jehovah's Witness endure or go through today exists. It's not there. Do you love this story as much as I do? I'd love to know. I love this story. But okay, I think we get the point. As I always do, and I don't know if it's just entertaining to only me, but a couple of other quick observations from this story from the deep, dark recesses and corners of my mind since I was a kid, baptized in '85, and then grew into a more mature man and elder. And look, I'm going to say it right now. These are some further and additional thoughts, some asterisks or addendums to the story that I would often dwell on when I couldn't sleep at night or was staring out a window in a car. Here we go. I'd love to get your thoughts. As you look at the story of the woman with the flow of blood, why exactly did Jesus feel the power leave his body? I know, it's crazy. She touched him, she dries up instantly and is healed, and Jesus is exhausted from that? I mean, here's the part I couldn't connect, folks, in this story, and I know I'm going off kilter and kind of getting away from the purpose of this episode, but just hours earlier, Jesus is seen fighting with demons. He sends them into pigs and off a cliff, and he's not tired. It seems like that was small potatoes for him. In Mark chapter 2, just slightly before the woman with the flow of blood, he heals a paralytic man that's lowered through the hole in the roof and makes him walk again. Not tired. I don't know. Doesn't have any questions about who touched him. In chapter 3 of Mark, a man with a withered hand shows up. Jesus heals him and touches him, and Jesus still feels great. He's not tired. He then ascends a mountain after healing the man and goes on a really small, mental exercise of choosing his 12 apostles. The guys that, incidentally, the governing body claim are the original members of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. So the mental stress on Jesus here must have tired him up, right? Nope, still feeling spry in Mark chapter 3. Then he goes on to try to eat. The crowd won't let him. Doesn't matter, doesn't eat. He still feels great. Not a word in any of these things leading up to the woman with the flow of blood about him getting tired or exhausted. But a woman in a crowd just touches him. She stops bleeding and he's absolutely wiped out. I can't connect that in my head. I'd love to hear what you think. Of equal interest to me in this story is that he doesn't know who touched him in the crowd. In fact, if you read the account carefully, you'll see that even the apostles think that's pretty weird. He apparently knows Peter will eventually deny him 3 times before a cock crows. He walks on water, all this stuff. But he's completely lost on who just touched his clothes in a crowd. I got some questions on that one. We'll leave it alone and move on. Here's a big one for me on this story. I feel like Jesus missed a golden opportunity here. And by the way, as I've already stated, I love this story. It's one of my favorites. But I still couldn't help but think Jesus missed a golden opportunity here. Or like so many other things the governing body tells 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses, maybe he just forgot, I don't know. But what a missed opportunity. And it's this. Am I the only one that saw this story as a perfect place in the Holy Book for Jesus to mention his policy on no blood transfusions? I mean, come on. At least in the story, he could have mentioned the no blood cards or maybe the medical directives that were coming, right? Is there a better place than this story in the Bible for him to mention it's better for someone to die than to actually take blood? It seems like such a massively missed opportunity to me, and always has. I mean, here, he's on the subject of blood and stuff, and to think he had 3 chances, because he had 3 different guys tell the story, to mention his no blood policy. I mean, Matthew 9 doesn't mention it here. Luke 8 doesn't mention it here. Mark 5 doesn't mention. They don't mention his cool no blood cards. Or more importantly, in this story, he never mentions his future May 22nd, 1994 Awake article where he celebrates little kids, children, dying because they skipped a blood transfusion and instead were just loyal to his publishing company. God, I hate that article. Ugh. I often thought this story, with all its love and compassion, would have been the perfect time for him to drop wisdom not found anywhere else in the Bible. For example, digging deep here, what's a blood fraction? And which ones did you, Jesus, create that we can take if we get a flow of blood? Why did you let your people get blood transfusions all the way up to the 1950s and then suddenly change your mind and decide blood transfusions were really bad? Were all the Jehovah's Witnesses that got blood transfusions before the 1950s walking around in the crowd, making everyone unclean and contaminating them, just like the woman with the flow of blood? How would you handle that if they were there, Jesus? Oh my. A subject for a probably multiple episodes. But here you've got a story about a woman with a flow of blood, and he doesn't hesitate to help her. Jehovah's Witnesses today on all issues concerning blood are told to die. They're told to die, even if you're a little kid. And parents let their kids die. Wow. Seems like a missed opportunity in this story. Just my take. But more random points as we wind this one down. Remember in this story that Jesus was on his way to help Jairus' daughter. She was very sick and she was on death's door. Well, in case you had never thought about it, my weird brain is here to help. By showing up, breaking the rules, and making everyone in the crowd unclean, this desperate woman created yet another disaster Jehovah's Witnesses and the governing body never mention. She delayed Jesus from getting to Jairus' daughter. In fact, as we just discussed, apparently she took some of his power, which raises a ton of questions on what happens next, a little thing called resurrection and how Jesus had any power left to make it happen. It always seemed to me that raising someone from the dead should be more exhausting than someone just touching your clothes. But hey, I digress. Back to the woman. She delayed Jesus and someone died. It's important to note, no one ever goes back to scold the woman. The woman never plunges into a deep depression under the massive weight of guilt and intrusive thoughts that she likely would have had that she played a role in a little girl dying. Nope. Again, she just gets healed. Jesus shows her some deep affection, calling her his daughter, and she never faces a judicial committee, or in fact is never mentioned again in the Bible. What? Seems like a great spot in this story for Jesus to show how to use guilt to crush people. You know, sort of like the 9 guys in upstate New York do every time someone makes a bad decision. But nope, I got nothing, folks. I got nothing. She delayed him, a little girl died, and it all worked out for the best. It was all okay. Try that today in 2023 among Jehovah's Witnesses. Try smoking a cigarette your friend knows and find out what happens to just both of you. Unbelievable. The depth missed in this story. The depth. And finally, I guess one last random thought that I've had that pops into my head. While this story has always been one of my favorites, it was also always such an emotional paradox for me. I mean, come on. In one split second in time, King Jesus of Jehovah's Witnesses heals a woman's misery. It's wonderful. In fact, he just showed up, she just showed up, and he did the rest. So why are we now 109 years into his reign as king, and people still continue to suffer in ways I don't even want to talk about? Why won't Jesus just heal this planet? How does he watch children suffer every day? Why won't he help children? Okay, the governing body has all the answers to that. We're still waiting. Just a random thought. So I digress. My own questions can get overwhelming, and no one wants to spend too much time inside my head, so there's that. But I hope you've stuck around this long episode, and you can see why this is one of my top 3 stories from the King of Jehovah's Witnesses. Wouldn't you agree that this story in the 2 we covered the last couple of weeks raised some genuine questions about the current climate and culture in Jehovah's Witnesses? I mean, whether it's the Good Samaritan, or it's the prodigal son, or it's this amazing woman healed with the flow of blood, the governing body seems to be missing a few things, folks. Things like helping and forgiving people, whether they agree with the 9 of them or not. You know, as they cross the road and leave the guy in the ditch to die, I got questions. Things like having mercy on people, Like the son who commits atrocious sins and his father is not only looking for him, but runs down the walk, puts some clothes and a ring on him, hugs him and kisses him, and gives him mercy. All without applying rules and appointing committees none of us can find in the stories or in the magic book. Or things like men or women who are hurting emotionally and physically. And the only answer from Jesus is compassion and practical, real help. Not just reading the holy book more or getting out in the car group and into the field service where you can hand out more magazines, as if that's an answer. The book and the man, the king, they claim to follow and that they claim speaks only to them, seems to have either changed since becoming king, forgot what he wrote in his magic book known as the Bible for all of mankind, or maybe he just made these stories up. Which really worries me considering he is the creator and he's the one keeping the planet rotating on its axis and the sun shining. Let's all hope he doesn't forget to do those things. Or as we close this down, could it be that Jehovah's Witnesses and the 9 guys that lead them with a heavy hand are an ever-evolving man-made scam that misleads millions and completely ignores the finer points of these stories in the Bible? Or could it be that they have nothing to do with Jesus of the Gospels at all? The proof is right there in these 3 basic stories I call my favorites. You don't need anything else if you're a person, a Jehovah's Witness, or a mentally diseased apostate. The answers to those questions about the governing body and Jehovah's Witnesses are right there in 3 stories in your book, Storytime with the King. I want to thank everybody for being here. I hope you enjoyed this 3-story installment. Wherever you may be, smile, smile, and be well. We'll see you next week.